Hi everyone, today I'm doing a review of the Coloured Raine Queen of Hearts palette, which looks like this. I just finished filming a 10 looks 1 palette on this palette, so I thought it was a good time to put my 2 cents in, especially now that I've used all the eyeshadows and played around with them and have tested their performance. It comes with 12 shades which look like this, 6 of which are matte and 6 of which are metallic or foiled. If you don't know about this brand, they are a Black-owned makeup brand and based in the USA, which I think is awesome. It was founded in 2013 by a woman named Lorraine D, which is why I guess she is calling it Coloured Raine to incorporate her name in it. This is a cruelty-free brand, although the products are not vegan because some of them do contain palm wine. So if that is a consideration, if that's something that that is important to you, then it's something to consider. In terms of the price, this was $50 US, and I did purchase it back in November 2016, and the exchange rate was about the same. So with shipping and all that, it kind of worked out to be about $70, $75, which is, for that price, I can buy a Too Faced chocolate bar palette, a Stila 12-pound palette, a Bare Minerals 12-pound palette. So it's in that price point. It is slightly cheaper than your Urban Decay naked palettes, which go for about $80. So I think for the price point, it's fairly reasonable. You're getting a decent amount of product. It has 17.5 grams net weight, which means it's 1.45 grams per eyeshadow, and I think that's a decent amount. So it's by no means your drugstore price or anything like that, but I do believe you're getting good quality and a decent amount of product for what you're paying. Now, in terms of swatches and performance of the eyeshadows, I'm going to show you what they look like with a brush as well as with a finger. In general, I found that all of them perform pretty well. I would say that they are not my favorite eyeshadows ever, and the reason why I'm saying this is because while the mattes are good, I have mattes that blend better. These aren't, by any means difficult to work with. The only one that I did have trouble with was Ladyship, which is this one. It does go on patchy. It does go on a little bit grainy. When you swirl it around in the pan, it has that grainy texture. However, there are ways to work around it. For example, using it in small quantities under the little lash line, I had no issues. Using it with a small pencil brush in specific areas, I had no problem with. But all over the mobile lid, it just did not work at all. Now, the metallic shades, they are definitely a denser and creamier formula. For example, something along the lines of your Makeup Forever. So I did find that they weren't necessarily the easiest eyeshadows to smoke out and blend out. You definitely had to go in a little bit more because they weren't so malleable. But again, you can make them work. And the matte eyeshadows are also like on the drier, powdery side. They didn't, however, give me a whole ton of fallout, and some of them didn't give me any fallout, which I thought was really, really good as well. So overall, I do like the formula. I do like this palette as a whole. I think it's very cohesive. I think it's very versatile. I have created a lot of looks out of this that I think are unique in themselves. They don't look all like the same thing. And I think that's really good because sometimes you get a palette and they all look different, but then when you put it on the eye, it all looks the same. So that is a really good thing. So this is definitely a palette that I can see myself traveling with, or, taking it somewhere and just using from this palette and not having to dip from multiple palettes to create one cohesive look, which is sometimes, quite annoying. I personally don't necessarily mind that, but for some people, they only want to use one palette at a time. And if you're that kind of person, then I think this is really good because there are, your transition shades, your accent shades, your pops of color, and a mix of metallic and mattes. So I think that's really good. So if you want to see swatches of this palette and how it performs, then just keep watching. So these are all the swatches over the Urban Decay Eyeshadow Primer Potion in Original. I totally forgot to do that in the live swatches, so I'm showing you what they look like all together here. So the first shade we have is Heir, which is described as a matte peach. It does have quite good pigmentation and it is buildable, but it doesn't conceal veins on the eyelids and it does cling to dry patches. So if you're like me with eczema, that's something to note. Also, these swatch way better with a brush than with fingers because of the dry texture. In terms of dupes, we have Toffee from the Lorac Mega Pro 3 palette, which seems almost the same except slightly lighter. Then we have the beige from the Visart Neutral Mattes palette, which is again even lighter, but it does have those same peachy undertones. Next we have Royal Prerogative, which is described as a matte terracotta, so brown with red undertones. I found this to be quite pigmented and easy to work with, and for me was a nice crease or transition shade if you're someone with my skin tone. So in terms of dupes in my collection, I had Maple from the Lorac Mega Pro 3 palette, which is slightly warmer and a bit darker. Then we have a brown shade from the Viseart Dark Mattes palette. Again, I would say this is deeper and warmer. Next is another Viseart eyeshadow. This is from the Neutrals palette. I would say it's a similar shade but different tone. Next dupe is Raw Sienna from the Modern Renaissance palette. It is probably slightly more golden and yellow in tone. The last one is from Marc Jacobs. I would say it's very similar, but this one does contain very fine shimmer particles in it. Next shade is one of my favorites. This is Noblewoman, and it's described as a metallic burgundy shade with purple undertones. Personally, I don't see purple undertones, I see orange undertones. I like this shade because it's very vibrant and intense without wetting your brush, and it doesn't crease on me. First dupe is from Viseart. It's definitely similar but not as intense. Then we have Calabar from the Masquerade palette. Again, not as foiled and intense. Viscera is darker, and also the texture is very different. It's a wax type texture. And then we have an eyeshadow from Lorac. I feel like Noblewoman is what Pomegranate should have been because it really lacks intensity. The next shade is Ladyship, which is a matte berry purple shade. As you can see from the swatch, it is the worst performing. It's very patchy and doesn't work very well all over the mobile lid, but in small quantities it works better. This shade also contains carmine, aka cochineal, so it's not vegan. First dupe is from Viseart, and this is definitely more magenta, but the formula is way better if you're looking for something in a similar color family. Then we have Electra, which is more similar to Ladyship, however it does lack the pigmentation. Although not strictly a dupe, I think Zobo would look great on cooler skin tones as an alternative to Ladyship, which is warmer. Lastly, we have Love Letter, which is probably the most similar shade I have in my collection. The formula is a lot better and it is slightly warmer. The fifth shade we have here is Duchess, and this is described as a matte milk chocolate brown. I've used this shade a lot in the crease to deepen up a smoky eye, and even though it doesn't swatch very well with fingers like most of these matte shades here, it does blend very well on the eye and it does have quite good pigmentation. First dupe is from Viseart. This shade is cooler and a bit more muted. Arizona from the Natasha Denona Green Brown palette is a lot more similar. In hindsight, I would say the Lorac eyeshadow looks a lot more like the Viseart one. It's muted and cooler. Then we have Chocolate, which is a single eyeshadow from Coloured Raine, and I would say this is a smidge darker. Last dupe is from the Master Palette by Mario. I would say this shade is slightly more intense and has more of a red undertone. Last in this row is Dethrone, which is a metallic brown with gold shimmers in it. In general, the metallics perform beautifully, and this one is no exception. First dupe is from Makeup Forever, and this shade is almost identical except slightly lighter. Then we have this one with the risque name. This one is slightly darker and the shimmers are a bit more bronze. Then we have Double Scoop, which is less shimmery and a bit more taupe. Sake Sashimi is slightly darker and also has gold and green sparkles. From the Lorac Unzip palette, this shade is much less shimmery and slightly darker. For high-end dupe, this is from Dior Quintet. It does swatch pretty badly with fingers, but it does apply well on the eyes. It's slightly lighter, a bit more matte, and the shimmers are less intense. First shade from the top row is Crown, which is a pearlescent white with gold undertones. I really liked this shade for inner corner highlight as well as highlighting my cheekbones, which is what I mainly used it for in my tutorials. First dupe is Clutch Pearls from Coloured Raine. I basically feel like this is the same eyeshadow because I can't tell the difference. Next dupe is a Natasha Denona eyeshadow. It is very intense and has a stronger yellow undertone. Then we have Radiance from Danessa Merrick's, which is a very underrated brand. Technically this is a highlighter, but I think this works well as an eyeshadow as well, and it's very finely milled. Next shade is Royal Highness, which is described as a metallic purple tone taupe. It's one of those shades that doesn't look like what is in the pan, so it's kind of disappointing because that purple tone doesn't pull through very strongly. Now onto the dupes. I actually don't have many for this shade. This one is from Urban Decay and it is less shimmery. So this one's not a very good dupe, but this one is from the Mario palette. It is more gold. Next shade is one of my favorites. This is Your Majesty and it is a rich metallic copper shade. First dupe is from Pat McGrath, the copper pigment. I would say that this is richer in tone and more of a true copper. Atria from the Star palette is slightly lighter and less shimmery. Casablanca from Juvia's Place is very similar but with more of a brown undertone. Next shade in the palette is Princess, which is a matte, dusty, muted rose pink shade. And again, I'm demonstrating how badly these matte shades perform with finger swatches. I think this is a good reason why it's good to compare brush and finger swatches, because sometimes one does better than the other. From the Ice Cream palette, Cone is similar but with a cooler brown undertone. Next one is technically a blush shade, but I do use it for eyeshadow. This one is slightly more of a plum shade. However, I found it sort of similar enough, and to be honest, I didn't have that many close dupes in my collection. Last one is probably the closest I have to Princess, although it is slightly more pink. Second last shade is Empress, which is a matte burnt orange shade, one of my favorites, and I have used this quite a lot in my 10 looks 1 palette challenge because I do really like these kind of orange warm tones. First dupe is a less intense version. I do prefer the Viseart formula because it is easier to blend. This shade is similar but less warm. Then we have this very intense version, which is slightly darker. Morocco is lighter and has more of a white base. And lastly, Cairo is like the shimmery version of Empress. Last shade in this palette is Queen Mother, which is a metallic plum shade with reddish brown undertones. I really enjoyed wearing this shade as a wash of colour all over the lid. First dupe is Maroon, which is slightly darker. From the Bijou Royale palette, this shade is slightly cooler. And lastly, I would say this shade is virtually the same as the last one. So those are all the swatches and the review of this Queen of Hearts palette. I hope you found that interesting and useful. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below and I'll get back to you. And thank you so much for watching.